What if a single discovery could shatter the foundations of everything we think we know? Imagine holding in your hand a tiny clay figure, no larger than your thumb, crudely shaped yet unmistakably human. To the untrained eye, it might look like a child's forgotten toy, a simple artifact of little consequence. But this object, known as the Nampa Figurine, is far more than it appears. It was pulled from deep beneath the earth in Idaho in the late 19th century, from a layer of sediment dated to a time long before modern humans were supposed to have set foot in the Americas. This small, unassuming piece of clay carries a question so profound it challenges the entire established timeline of human history on this continent. It asks us to reconsider not just when humans arrived here, but the very story of our ancient past. The mystery begins in 1889, when workers drilling an artesian well in Nampa, Idaho, made a startling find. From a layer of clay and gravel over 300 feet below the surface, a layer geologists believe was formed during the Pleistocene epoch, a staggering 2 million years ago. Their pump brought up this handmade figurine. The immediate implication was, and remains, earth-shattering. Conventional archaeology tells us that the first humans crossed into the Americas from Siberia via the Bering Land Bridge only around 15,000 years ago. Yet here was a man-made object recovered from a stratum that predates that event by an almost incomprehensible margin. Was it a mistake, a hoax, or is it possible that our understanding of human history is fundamentally and dramatically incomplete? This isn't just an academic debate, it's a puzzle that touches the very core of who we are and where we come from. As we begin this investigation together, we are not just examining an artifact, we are stepping into a shadowy corridor of history, a place where official narratives break down and extraordinary possibilities emerge. The Nampa Figurine represents one of the most compelling and controversial anomalies in all of North American archaeology. Its very existence pits careful scientific observation against the rigid framework of established theory. Over the course of this video, we will delve into the incredible story of its discovery, scrutinize the vehement arguments for and against its authenticity, and explore the staggering implications if this little clay figure is genuinely what it appears to be. This is a journey into a profound historical mystery, a quest for a truth that has been buried not just in the ground but by time itself. So let's turn the first page on this forgotten chapter and see what secrets this ancient artifact is waiting to reveal. The scene in 1889 was one of industry and expectation. The small town of Nampa, Idaho, was expanding, and its growing population needed a reliable source of water. A crew of workers was hired to drill an artesian well, a process that involved driving a pipe deep into the earth through layer after layer of ancient soil and rock. They worked steadily downward, piercing through strata that had been laid down over countless millennia, each foot taking them further back in geological time. When the drill reached a depth of around 320 feet, it penetrated a particularly dense layer of clay and gravel. This was no ordinary soil. To geologists, this was a clearly identified stratum from the Pleistocene epoch, a period often called the Ice Age. The material brought up by the sand pump was, by all scientific accounts, 2 million years old. And then, amid the slurry of dark clay and stones, something entirely unexpected emerged. One of the workers, sifting through the discharged material, found a small, hardened clay object. It was a tiny human figurine, just over 1.5 inches long, shaped by human hands. The initial reaction was likely a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Here was a clearly artificial object, a crafted piece of art, staring back at them from a depth that seemed to make its existence impossible. It wasn't lying loosely on the surface, waiting to be kicked by a passerby. It wasn't found in a recent archaeological dig. This figurine was extracted from a deep, undisturbed geological horizon, a layer that had been sealed shut for epochs. The significance of this context cannot be overstated. For an object to be genuinely ancient, it must be found in a secure primary context, meaning the layer it came from must be intact, with no signs of later disturbance like animal burrows, root channels, or fissures that could have allowed a more recent object to filter down from above. The geologists who examined the site, including the highly respected G. Frederick Wright, were adamant that the clay layer was undisturbed. This wasn't a question of something falling down a hole. It was a question of something being in the exact place it was when that layer of earth was formed, a moment frozen in deep time. Consider what the established timeline of human history told us about this period. According to the scientific consensus of the late 19th century, and largely still held today, the first humans did not arrive in the Americas until the very end of the Pleistocene, around 13 to 15,000 years ago. These were the so-called Clovis people, whose distinct stone tools have been found at sites across the continent. But the layer that cradled the Nampa figurine was not 15,000 years old. It was 2 million years old. That is a discrepancy of time so vast it's difficult to truly comprehend. If the figurine is authentic, it doesn't just push back the clock on human habitation in the Americas, it shatters it completely. It suggests a human presence so ancient that it predates the evolution of our own species, Homo sapiens, which only emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago. This single, tiny artifact pulled from the Idaho earth was posing a question that threatened to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the human journey across the globe. So let's get a closer look at this object that carries such an impossible weight of history. The Nampa figurine itself is a small, hand-molded statuette made from a brownish-red clay that was then fired to a remarkable hardness, giving it the durability to survive its incredible journey through time. It measures just over 1.5 inches in length, small enough to sit comfortably on the tip of your finger. Its form is what archaeologists often term anthropomorphic. It clearly represents a human figure, but it is undeniably crude in its execution. The body is a simple, rounded shape with a distinct head, a tapered torso, and stubby, protruding limbs. There is no fine detail, no face has been carved, no fingers or toes are indicated. It is the essence of a human form, captured in its most basic, primordial state. The surface is smooth in some places and slightly pitted in others, bearing the subtle, unpolished texture of something shaped by an ancient hand, not a modern tool. There are no intricate carvings or painted markings, which only adds to its enigmatic, primal quality. When you hold this image in your mind, its simplicity is its greatest strength. This is not a finely sculpted, museum-grade piece that might be the product of a sophisticated, known civilization. It is something far more primal and personal. It has the feel of a talisman or a totem, perhaps a child's toy made by a loving parent, or a ritual object imbued with meaning for a people whose very name is lost to us. Its unpretentious nature is precisely what makes the arguments against its antiquity so difficult to accept. If you were a 19th century hoaxer looking to create a sensation, would you create something so plain, so devoid of the obvious artistic flair that would guarantee headlines? It seems far more likely that a forger would have crafted something more dramatic, perhaps a figure with a detailed face or holding a weapon. The Nampa figurine's very plainness speaks to an authenticity that is grounded in the practical and the symbolic needs of a truly ancient culture. This modest appearance stands in stark, almost poetic contrast to the monumental implications it carries. We are asked to believe that this tiny, unadorned piece of clay was shaped by human hands 2 million years ago. To put that timescale into perspective, that places its creation in an era when, according to conventional science, the most advanced human ancestor on the entire planet was Homo habilis, an early hominid in Africa known for using simple stone tools. The idea that a being at that same moment in deep time was in what is now Idaho purposefully working clay into a human form is so revolutionary it feels like science fiction. It suggests a level of symbolic thought, of art and abstraction, that we do not attribute to any hominid of that period anywhere in the world. This isn't just about who was in America first, it's a challenge to the entire narrative of human cognitive evolution. The figurine's physical simplicity, therefore, is a deception. It is a quiet, unassuming key that threatens to unlock a door to a past so radically different from our understanding that its true form is not just clay, but a question mark made solid. To understand why this discovery sent such shockwaves through the scientific community, we have to grasp the fundamental principle that governs archaeology and geology, stratigraphy. It's a simple but powerful concept. Imagine the Earth's crust as a massive, layered cake. Over millions of years, sediment, dust, volcanic ash, and organic material settle, one layer on top of another. The oldest layers are naturally at the bottom, with progressively younger layers stacked above them. This isn't just a theory, it's an observable, testable law of nature. When an object is found within a specific layer, its age is considered to be the same as the layer itself, provided that layer is sealed and undisturbed. This is the absolute cornerstone of dating anything that comes from the ground. The Nampa figurine wasn't found in a mixed-up surface layer. It was recovered from a deep, pristine stratum, and this is where the mystery locks into place with geological certainty. The specific formation in question is known as the Glen's Ferry Formation. This isn't some obscure or debated geological feature. It's a well-defined and extensively studied sequence of sediments in the western Snake River Plain. Geologists have mapped and dated these layers using a variety of methods, primarily through the analysis of volcanic ash deposits and the fossilized remains of extinct animals found within them. The consensus, backed by decades of research, places the age of the specific strata the drill penetrated at around 2 million years. This was the Pleistocene epoch, a time of ice ages and colossal mammals like mammoths and giant ground sloths. The layer itself was a dense, hard-packed clay, and crucially, the initial reports from the geologists on site noted that it showed no signs of cracking, fissures, or any other pathways that could have served as a conduit for a modern object to sink down from above. Now, here is the detail that truly clinches the argument for the figurine's ancient origin. When the sand pump brought the figurine to the surface, it wasn't just loose dirt that came up. The workers reported that the small clay figure was found encased within a solid lump of clay, almost like a protective cocoon. This lump, sometimes described as a nipple or a nodule of clay, was not a separate piece that had fallen in. The geologists who examined it, including G. Frederick Wright of the Boston Society of Natural History, were emphatic that this clay nodule was continuous and homogeneous with the surrounding, undisturbed layer of the Glen's Ferry Formation. It was, for all intents and purposes, an integral part of that 2-million-year-old stratum. This single observation is perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case. It means the figurine was not simply lying in a hole. It was enveloped by the clay as the clay itself was being deposited and solidified. For the object to have gotten there recently, it would have had to somehow burrow its way down over 300 feet through solid, compacted earth and then become perfectly reburied in a newly formed, seamless lump of ancient clay, a geological impossibility. Think about what this implies for the possibility of a hoax or a simple accident. Could a worker have dropped the figurine into the drill hole? Even if someone had tried, the mechanics of the drilling process make this wildly improbable. The drill was a hollow pipe, and the material from the bottom was brought up by a powerful sand pump that was clearing out debris. Any object dropped from the surface would have been pulverized by the drilling action or simply wouldn't have been sucked back up from that immense depth. More importantly, it could not have somehow become magically encased in a perfectly formed nodule of clay that matched the undisturbed layer around it. The very nature of its discovery sealed inside that ancient clay creates an almost airtight case for its genuine antiquity. This places the artifact firmly within a time frame that is not just inconvenient for established theories, it is catastrophic for them. We are left with a stark choice. Either we accept that our models of human migration and evolution are profoundly wrong, or we must believe in a series of highly improbable and physically dubious events that would have been necessary to plant the figurine in that specific sealed context. The geology of the site presents a puzzle that is both simple and profound, a conundrum written in layers of clay and time that we have yet to fully solve. When news of the Nampa discovery first reached the halls of science, it triggered a storm of controversy that perfectly captures the tension between a startling new piece of evidence and the comforting weight of established belief. The scientific consensus of the late 19th century was a fortress, built on the clear and seemingly unassailable idea that humans were recent arrivals to the New World. The dominant model, championed by leading institutions, posited that the first peoples had crossed from Siberia perhaps a mere 3,000 or 4,000 years earlier. Into this neatly ordered timeline, the Nampa figurine crashed like a meteorite. It was an anomaly that simply should not exist, and the immediate reaction from many mainstream scholars was not curiosity but dismissal. They instinctively sought ways to explain it away, to force this square peg into the round hole of their existing paradigm. The most common rebuttal was the intrusion theory, the suggestion that the artifact must have fallen down a deep fissure or an animal burrow, working its way down from the surface over centuries to settle in an older layer. This argument, however, ran into the immediate and formidable obstacle of the geology itself. The initial investigators, including the well-respected geologist G. Frederick Wright, had been on site and had personally attested to the undisturbed, homogeneous nature of the clay stratum. They reported no such fissures, no root channels, no evidence of any kind of disturbance that could have served as a vertical chimney for a modern object to descend over 300 feet. To accept the intrusion theory, one had to ignore the direct field observations of experienced geologists. This is where the support of a figure like George Frederick Wright becomes so pivotal to the story. Wright was not a fringe theorist. He was a respected member of the Boston Society of Natural History and a man with a solid reputation. His book, The Ice Age in North America, was an authoritative work in the field. When a scientist of his standing examined the site and the encasing clay nodule and concluded that the figurine was genuinely ancient, it forced the academic world to take notice. Wright argued with geological certainty that the object was in situ, meaning it was found in the exact place it had been when the sediment layer was formed. He pointed to the seamless integration of the clay lump surrounding the figurine with the broader matrix of the Glens Ferry Formation. For him, the evidence was clear and physical. The artifact was as old as the earth that held it. His endorsement gave the find a credibility it would have otherwise lacked, transforming it from a curious local story into a national scientific dilemma. It created a stark divide between those who trusted the raw, physical data from the field and those who clung to the theoretical models that the data now threatened to overturn. The skeptics, however, were armed with more than just theory. They raised what they considered logical objections grounded in common sense. One persistent line of attack focused on the figurine's composition. Some critics asked how a fired clay object could have survived 2 million years without disintegrating, given that ceramic, while hard, is also brittle. This argument, though, overlooks the remarkable preservative qualities of being sealed in a deep, anoxic, and stable environment. Protected from freeze-thaw cycles, water flow, and biological activity, an object can remain intact for astonishing lengths of time. A more emotionally charged and frankly less scientific objection was the sheer impossibility of the figurine's implied history. The idea that any human or even hominid could have been in Idaho 2 million years ago was to them not just wrong but laughable. It conflicted with everything they thought they knew about human evolution and migration. This reveals a profound psychological barrier in science. When faced with evidence that contradicts a foundational belief, the initial impulse is often to reject the evidence rather than reconsider the foundation. The Nampa figurine became a Rorschach test for the scientific community. Those who saw it as authentic believed in the primacy of field observation. Those who saw it as a hoax or an error were prioritizing the integrity of their established narrative about human history. The hoax theory itself has been scrutinized relentlessly, and it too collapses under the weight of the circumstances. What would have been the motive for a group of Idaho well drillers in 1889 to fabricate such an artifact? They were not archaeologists seeking fame, they were laborers hired to find water. The concept of Pleistocene epoch, or 2 million years, was not part of the public lexicon in a way that would make for a plausible forgery. A hoaxer typically creates something that fits an expected narrative to gain acceptance, not something that so violently contradicts all known narratives. Furthermore, the method of its discovery, being brought up by a sand pump from over 300 feet down and encased in a solid lump of clay, presents a logistical nightmare for any would-be prankster. How would they have planted it in such a way? The entire process was witnessed and the material brought up was inspected by multiple people. The simplest explanation, however uncomfortable it may be, is often the correct one. The object was found exactly where and how it was reported. The story of the Nampa figurine's reception is a classic case study in the sociology of knowledge. It shows us that science does not always proceed in a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. Sometimes a disruptive truth emerges, and the scientific establishment, like any human institution, can struggle to accept it, preferring instead to protect the walls of its existing fortress from a reality that threatens to bring them tumbling down. Given the sheer weight of the geological evidence, the hoax hypothesis inevitably becomes the final refuge for skeptics, a last-ditch effort to reconcile the artifact with a comfortable worldview. So let's put this theory under the microscope and ask the fundamental question: could this entire affair have been an elaborate deception? To answer that, we need to look closely at the people involved and the practical realities of the situation. The discovery was made by a crew of well drillers, men whose primary concern was finding water for the town of Nampa, not securing a place in the annals of archaeology. They had no apparent motive to orchestrate a complex fraud. There was no fame or fortune to be gained. The figurine generated local curiosity, but it didn't make its finders rich or famous. In the late 19th century, the concept of a 2-million-year-old artifact wasn't even a mainstream idea that a prankster would logically exploit. A successful hoax typically plays into an existing expectation or a known controversy, but the Nampa figurine created a controversy all on its own, one that was entirely unexpected. Consider the monumental challenge of actually planting such a hoax. We're not talking about dropping a trinket into a shallow hole. This object was recovered from over 300 feet below the surface from a specific sealed layer of Pleistocene clay. To fabricate this scenario, a conspirator would have needed to somehow lower the figurine down the narrow drill pipe and then, through some unknown mechanism, have it become perfectly encased in a solid, seamless nodule of clay that was chemically and physically identical to the surrounding undisturbed stratum. The drilling process itself involved a powerful sand pump that was constantly clearing debris from the borehole. Any object deliberately introduced would have been smashed to pieces by the drilling apparatus or simply flushed away by the pump. The idea that a worker could have engineered this precise set of conditions beggars belief. It requires a level of geological expertise and access to equipment that the average laborer simply did not possess. Beyond the physical improbabilities, we must also consider the character and credibility of the witnesses. The initial report wasn't just a tall tale told in a saloon. It was documented and investigated by reputable professionals, including geologist G. Frederick Wright. These were trained observers who specifically looked for signs of disturbance and found none. they staked their professional reputations on the integrity of the find. To believe in a hoax is to also believe that these experienced scientists were either easily fooled or were willing accomplices in a deception, neither of which is supported by any evidence. The simplest explanation, and the one that aligns with the direct physical evidence from the site, is that the figurine was found exactly as reported, brought up from the depths encased in ancient clay, a genuine relic from a time that should not have been. While the human mind naturally seeks familiar explanations, sometimes the most logical conclusion is also the most extraordinary. The hoax hypothesis, when examined closely, doesn't resolve the mystery. It simply adds another layer of implausibility to an already incredible story. Another common explanation offered by skeptics points to the natural world, suggesting the figurine might have been carried down from the surface not by human trickery, but by the slow, persistent work of nature itself. This is the idea of bioturbation, a process where animals like rodents or gophers, or even the growth and decay of plant roots, churn and mix soil layers over long periods. A small object on the surface could, in theory, be gradually enveloped by soil from below as a creature digs, or it could fall into an existing burrow that later fills with sediment, creating the illusion that it belongs to a much deeper, older layer. It's a perfectly reasonable mechanism, one that archaeologists must always consider when an object seems out of place. In the case of the Nampa figurine, however, this theory runs into the same immovable obstacle that challenged the simple intrusion idea, the direct observations of the geologists who examined the site. G. Frederick Wright and his colleagues were not amateurs. They were specifically looking for signs of such disturbance. They reported that the layer of clay from which the figurine was extracted was dense, compact, and critically, it was cemented. This wasn't loose, fluffy topsoil that a ground squirrel could easily tunnel through. It was a hardened, cohesive stratum that showed no evidence of the tunnels, fillings, or root casts that bioturbation leaves behind like a signature. Think about what it would take for a small object to descend over 300 feet through such material solely by natural means. It would require a continuous vertical channel, a single open pathway stretching from the surface all the way down to that specific layer. For this channel to remain open long enough for the figurine to fall through, and then to be perfectly filled in with material that matched the surrounding, undisturbed clay so seamlessly that it formed a homogeneous nodule around the object, defies the known behavior of soil mechanics and geology. Burrows and root channels in such ancient, compacted deposits do not remain open for millennia. They collapse, they fill with material that is often visibly different from the surrounding matrix, and they leave clear, telltale signs of their presence. The geologists found none of this. The clay nodule that encased the figurine was described as being of one piece with the stratum, indicating it was formed at the same time and under the same conditions as the rest of the layer. For the rodent burrow theory to be viable, we must accept that a series of incredibly fortunate and geologically unique events occurred, creating a perfect invisible chimney through 300 feet of solid earth that left no trace of its existence, all to deliver one small clay figure to an impossible depth. This stretches the idea of a natural explanation into the realm of special pleading, inventing an unseen process to explain away an inconvenient piece of evidence. The cemented nature of the clay is perhaps the most decisive factor here. When sediment becomes cemented, its particles are bound together by minerals, effectively turning soft earth into a rock-like mass. This process makes it virtually impossible for any significant bioturbation to occur after cementation has taken place. Animals cannot burrow through solid rock, and roots cannot penetrate it. The Glens Ferry Formation at that depth was precisely this kind of hardened, stable layer. This means the stratigraphic context was effectively locked in place millions of years ago. For the figurine to have been introduced later, it would have had to be placed there before or during the cementation process itself. The argument from bioturbation, while scientifically sound in principle, simply does not align with the specific physical conditions documented at the Nampa site. It becomes a generic one-size-fits-all skeptical rebuttal that ignores the particularities of the case. We are left with a choice between trusting the detailed field assessment of trained geologists who saw no evidence of disturbance, or believing in an unseen, hypothetical disturbance for which there is no physical proof, all to preserve a timeline that the artifact itself directly challenges. To grasp the full force of the collision between the Nampa figurine and established science, we need to understand the immense fortress of an idea it was challenging. For much of the 20th century, the dominant narrative of the human arrival in the Americas was summed up by two words: Clovis First. This wasn't just a minor hypothesis, it was the foundational cornerstone of North American archaeology, a paradigm so deeply ingrained that it shaped textbooks, museum exhibits, and generations of research. The story it told was clean, logical, and compelling. It began with the discovery of a unique and exquisitely crafted stone tool. In the 1930s, near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, archaeologists unearthed distinctive spear points embedded among the bones of extinct mammoths. These were not simple, crude rocks. They were sophisticated artifacts characterized by a central groove or flute running partway up their length. This fluting was a technological marvel, allowing the point to be securely hafted onto a wooden spear shaft. The craftsmanship was undeniable, and their association with giant Ice Age animals painted a dramatic picture of the first big game hunters on the continent. As more of these fluted points were found at sites across North America, a clear timeline began to emerge. Radiocarbon dating, a revolutionary new technique at the time, consistently placed these Clovis sites at around 13,000 years old. This became the accepted benchmark. According to the Clovis First model, around that time, small bands of highly adaptable hunter-gatherers from Siberia began crossing into Alaska. They were able to make this journey because much of the world's water was locked up in massive ice sheets, lowering sea levels and exposing a vast land bridge known as Beringia. These pioneers, the story goes, then found an ice-free corridor between the colossal Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, a narrow pathway that opened up into the untouched wilderness of the Americas. From there, with their superior projectile technology, they rapidly spread southward, their descendants eventually populating two entire continents in what seemed like a geological blink of an eye. This narrative provided a clear and elegant origin story, and for decades, any archaeological claim that suggested a human presence before 13,000 years ago was met with intense skepticism and often outright dismissal. The Clovis culture was not just considered the first culture in the Americas. For many, it was the only culture that could have been first. This is the immense wall of scientific consensus that the Nampa figurine was confronting. The Clovis First model created a powerful, self-reinforcing system. It established a boundary line in time, a before and after for human history on the continent. Any artifact claiming to be older than Clovis was immediately viewed as an anomaly, an outlier that was more likely to be the result of a dating error, a misinterpreted geological context, or an outright hoax than a genuine challenge to the paradigm. The Nampa figurine wasn't just a little bit older than Clovis. It was, according to the geology, nearly 200 times older. It wasn't merely pushing at the boundaries of the Clovis model. It was standing far outside the walls and declaring the entire fortress built on an incomplete map. The implications were staggering. If the figurine was authentic, then the story of the peopling of the Americas was not a relatively recent event tied to the end of the last ice age. It was a much deeper, more complex, and likely multi-chaptered saga, one that involved human or hominid populations arriving by means and at times we have yet to even conceive. Think about the technological and cognitive gap this implies. The Clovis people were undeniably modern humans, Homo sapiens, with a sophisticated understanding of stone tool production. The maker of the Nampa figurine, if its dating is correct, would have lived in a world where the most advanced human ancestors elsewhere were likely Homo erectus, a species we associate with simple hand axes, not symbolic art. The creation of a figurine, even a crude one, represents a leap in cognitive ability. It suggests self-awareness, abstract thought, and the capacity to create a symbolic representation of the human form. This places an incredible burden of proof on a single, tiny object. It's one thing to find a crude stone tool that could be 2 million years old. It's another thing entirely to find a fired clay figurine from the same period. The Nampa discovery challenged not just the when of American prehistory, but the who and the what, who these people were and what they were capable of. The Clovis First paradigm provided a comfortable, well-defined starting point. The Nampa figurine pointed to a beginning so deep and so shadowy that it threatened to plunge the entire narrative into a mystery far greater than anyone had anticipated. And yet, the story of the Nampa figurine is far from an isolated incident in the archives of archaeology. When we pull back the lens, we see it is merely one star in a whole constellation of baffling discoveries, each one a stubborn puzzle piece that refuses to fit into the official picture of our past. These objects, known collectively as out-of-place artifacts or OP arts, emerge from the ground with a consistent and haunting message that our historical timeline is incomplete. One of the most famous of these is the Calaveras skull. In 1866, miners in Calaveras County, California, were digging a shaft deep below a layer of lava when they reportedly uncovered a human cranium. This wasn't just any skull, it was found nestled in gold-bearing gravels that geologists dated to the Pleistocene epoch, an astonishing 30 to 40 million years old. The immediate uproar was predictable. The scientific establishment of the day, which largely held to a recent timeline for humanity, declared it an obvious hoax, suggesting that the skull of a modern Native American had been planted as a practical joke. Yet, the miners and the initial investigators insisted the surrounding sediments were undisturbed. The controversy raged for decades, with some respected scientists, like the state geologist of California, initially vouching for its authenticity. The Calaveras skull remains a profound enigma, a silent challenge from a time when humans, by all rights, should not have existed. The pattern repeats itself with another iconic find, the London hammer. In 1936, a couple walking along a creek near London, Texas, noticed a curious piece of wood protruding from a rock ledge. When they pried it loose, they found it was the handle of a hammer, its head firmly embedded in a concretion of limestone. This wasn't a simple case of a tool being lost. The rock itself had formed around the hammer. Subsequent analysis dated the surrounding stone to the Cretaceous period, over 100 million years old. Critics were quick to pounce, arguing that the iron-rich head showed no signs of bubbling, a hallmark of ancient, primitive smelting, and that the wooden handle was oddly preserved. They proposed that the hammer was a more recent miner's tool around which a hard, limestone concretion had formed relatively quickly, a process known to occur under certain mineral-rich conditions. However, proponents point to studies of the iron itself, which they claim shows a remarkable purity and a crystalline structure not typical of modern steel, suggesting an unfamiliar and possibly ancient metallurgical process. The London hammer, therefore, presents us with two equally perplexing possibilities. Either it is a genuine artifact from a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth, or it is a demonstration of how quickly nature can entomb an object, creating a perfect mimic of an impossible antiquity. In either case, it forces us to question our assumptions about both history and geology. What binds these disparate finds, the Nampa figurine, the Calaveras skull, the London hammer, together is not just their controversial dating, but the strikingly similar pattern of their reception by mainstream science. In each instance, the immediate reaction from the academic establishment was not one of open-minded curiosity, but of swift and often dismissive skepticism. The default position was to assume a hoax, a misidentification, or a geological fluke. While healthy skepticism is the bedrock of good science, a pattern of automatic rejection can start to look less like rigorous scrutiny and more like a defensive reflex. This raises a difficult and uncomfortable question. Does a potential bias exist within mainstream archaeology? Is the field sometimes too protective of its established paradigms, to the point that anomalous evidence is explained away rather than investigated thoroughly? The Clovis First model we discussed earlier functioned for decades as a powerful paradigm, a term philosopher Thomas Kuhn used to describe the set of accepted theories and practices that define a scientific field at any given time. Kuhn observed that science does not always progress smoothly. Instead, it undergoes periodic revolutions, paradigm shifts, where old models collapse under the weight of too many anomalies, and a new, more comprehensive framework takes their place. Seen through this lens, artifacts like the Nampa Figurine are not mere curiosities. They are the potential catalysts for such a shift. They are the anomalies that could, if validated, force a fundamental rewriting of our history books. This explains the fierce resistance they often encounter. Accepting a 2-million-year-old figurine from Idaho doesn't just add a new chapter to human history. It requires throwing out the entire existing book and starting over. It invalidates decades of research, challenges cherished theories, and humbles the very experts who built their careers on the old model. The psychological and institutional inertia against such a change is enormous. This isn't necessarily a conspiracy to hide the truth. It is simply the way human institutions, including science, naturally operate. They build walls of consensus to create stability and order, and anything that threatens to breach those walls is met with formidable resistance. The journey of these out-of-place artifacts, therefore, is about more than just clay, bone, and iron. It is a story about the sociology of knowledge, a dramatic clash between hard evidence and hardened belief, where the ultimate discovery may not be a forgotten civilization, but a deeper understanding of how we come to know our own story. So if the geology of the site presents such a formidable case for the figurine's age, the next logical step is to turn our attention to the object itself. What can the actual material, the clay from which it was formed, tell us about its origins? Scientific analysis of the figurine's composition becomes a vital line of inquiry, a way to test its story against the chemistry of the earth from which it came. The initial observations were clear. The figurine is made from a brownish-red clay that has been hardened almost to the consistency of stone. This hardening was immediately recognized as the result of firing. Clay in its natural state is soft and malleable. It only gains that lasting hardness when it is subjected to intense heat, a process that permanently alters its molecular structure. This single fact is profoundly significant. It means that whoever made this object didn't just shape wet mud and let it dry in the sun. They possessed the knowledge and control of fire necessary to transform clay into ceramic, a technological leap that represents one of humanity's earliest and most important chemical processes. The very substance of the figurine points to an intentional, skilled act of creation. But where did this clay originate? Could it have been sourced locally from the very strata that cradled it for millennia? The surrounding Glens Ferry Formation is rich in clay deposits, and initial comparisons suggested a visual and textural similarity. However, a more definitive answer would require sophisticated mineralogical analysis. If the clay in the figurine perfectly matches the specific mineral signature of the deep, undisturbed layer it was found in, it would powerfully support the argument that the object was both made and deposited in that same ancient era. It would mean the creator used materials immediately available to them, a scenario that feels intuitively correct for an ancient people. On the other hand, if the clay's composition is different, it could suggest the object was made elsewhere and transported, or worse, that it was a modern forgery using clay from a different, more recent source. While a full, modern geochemical analysis has not been widely publicized, the early investigators noted the strong resemblance. The clay nodule that encased the figurine was continuous with the surrounding matrix, implying a common origin. This physical connection between the artifact and its geological context is a silent but powerful testimony, suggesting the raw material and the final resting place are one and the same. Consider the implications if the clay is indeed local and ancient. It would mean that the entire life cycle of this object, from the gathering of the raw material to the shaping by human hands to the firing in a controlled blaze and its ultimate loss or deposition, all occurred within that same remote epoch. There is a profound cohesion to this idea. The artifact is not an alien intrusion but an integral part of its environment, a product of its time. The technology required to fire clay does not necessarily demand a sophisticated kiln. Even an open pit fire can reach the temperatures needed to sinter clay particles, especially for a small object like this. This places the feat within the realm of possibility for a resourceful, ancient people. The analysis of the material, therefore, does more than just authenticate, it builds a narrative. It allows us to envision a moment 2 million years ago when someone along the ancient Snake River gathered clay from the bank, shaped it into a human form with deliberate care, and hardened it in the embers of a fire, creating an object that would outlast empires, ice ages, and the very memory of its maker, waiting in the deep darkness for its story to be told again. But beyond the object's composition lies another, more subtle layer of evidence, one that is written directly onto its surface. When an object rests in the earth for an immense span of time, the very ground imparts its own signature, a kind of chemical diary that records the passage of millennia. This is the phenomenon of patina, a thin, often encrusted layer that forms on the surface of artifacts through prolonged chemical interaction with the surrounding soil and groundwater. On the Nampa figurine, this telltale sign of great age is not just present, it is pronounced. Experts who have examined the statuette have consistently noted the presence of dark, almost black, stains and crusty deposits adhering firmly to the clay. These are not random bits of dirt, they are identified as manganese dioxide stains, a specific type of mineral accretion that forms with agonizing slowness over vast periods. To understand why this is so significant, picture a newly fired clay pot buried in the ground. Initially, its surface is clean and uniform, but as centuries turn into millennia, water percolating through the soil dissolves minute amounts of minerals, particularly manganese and iron. These mineral-rich solutions slowly seep into the microscopic pores of the clay. When conditions are right, the minerals precipitate out of the water and crystallize on the surface and within the pores of the object, building up an incredibly thin but tenacious layer. This process is not something that happens in a few years or even a few centuries. The development of a thick, well-integrated manganese dioxide patina of the kind seen on the Nampa figurine is the work of many thousands, if not millions, of years. It is a timescale that cannot be faked with any known modern technique. This is the crux of the argument. A forger in the 1880s could have easily taken a piece of clay, shaped it, and fired it in a fire to harden it. They could have even rolled it in mud to make it look dirty, but replicating the specific, deep-seated chemical bonding of a genuine manganese patina is an entirely different challenge. Artificial aging methods, like applying acids or stains, tend to produce a superficial, often uneven coating that sits on top of the surface. It can be scratched or washed off relatively easily. A genuine, ancient patina, by contrast, is not a coating at all. It is an integral part of the object's surface history. The minerals have actually migrated into the fabric of the clay itself, forming a bond that is both chemical and physical. On the Nampa figurine, these deposits are reported to be firmly adherent, as much a part of the object as the clay from which it was formed. This kind of deep mineralogical integration is a hallmark of authentic antiquity, a silent witness to the object's long, dormant slumber deep within the earth. Furthermore, the specific conditions required for this type of patination add another layer of credibility to its provenance. The formation of manganese dioxide layers is highly dependent on the local geochemistry of the burial environment. The Glens Ferry Formation, with its specific mix of clays, gravels, and mineral-rich groundwater, provided the perfect chemical cradle for this process to occur. The patina on the figurine is therefore consistent with the very geology that claimed it. It's a perfect match not just in terms of age but in terms of place. The object and its environment tell the same story from two different angles. The geology confirms the depth and age of the stratum, and the patina on the artifact confirms its long-term residence within that same stratum. This convergence of evidence creates a powerful, mutually reinforcing case. The idea that a forger could have not only fabricated the object, but also perfectly simulated the multi-millennial chemical weathering process specific to a deep Pleistocene clay layer stretches credulity to its breaking point. The patina is more than just a sign of age. It is the physical embodiment of time itself, a chemical clock that seems to point decisively to an origin lost in the deep, misty epochs of our planet's past. Now we come to a question that takes us right into the mind of the creator, a puzzle that involves looking so closely at the object that we can almost see the hands that shaped it. How exactly was this figurine made, and what can the subtle clues of its construction tell us about the people who held it 2 million years ago? This is the toolmark mystery, and it requires us to become detectives, examining the physical evidence left behind during its creation. The first thing that strikes any observer is the figurine's profound simplicity. There is no intricate carving, no fine detailing, no indication that any hard, sharp tool was used to incise features into the clay. The shaping appears to have been done almost entirely by hand, through pinching, rolling, and pressing the soft, pliable material. You can envision the process. A small lump of local clay was gathered, likely from a nearby deposit, and then meticulously worked between someone's fingers and thumbs. The head was formed by pinching and pulling a portion of the main body upward. The limbs were created by rolling out smaller cylinders of clay and attaching them to the torso, and the entire form was then smoothed over, likely with a damp finger or a smooth piece of leather or wood, to blend the seams and create a more unified shape. This complete absence of sharp tool marks is in itself a powerful piece of evidence. If this were a modern forgery created in the late 19th century, the forger would have had access to metal tools, a knife for trimming, a needle for adding detail, any number of implements to create a more finished and convincing look. The fact that the object shows no such marks strongly suggests a pre-metalworking culture. The tools used were almost certainly organic and perishable. Fingers, thumbs, perhaps a smooth river stone to burnish the surface, or a sliver of bone or wood for making the most basic of impressions. The rounded, almost blob-like nature of the form speaks to a technology that is fundamentally elemental, rooted in the most direct human interaction with a natural material. It has the authentic feel of a folk art object, something made not for display in a temple, but for a personal, perhaps spiritual or playful purpose, using only what was immediately available in the environment. Then comes the critical technological leap, the firing. The clay was not simply sun-dried, it was intentionally hardened by fire. This transforms the object from a fragile lump of mud into a durable ceramic, and it represents a significant cognitive and practical achievement. Creating a fire hot enough to sinter clay, a process where the particles fuse without fully melting, requires control. It wouldn't have required a sophisticated kiln. An open pit fire, carefully managed with a bed of hot embers, could easily reach the necessary temperatures, which are typically between 600 and 900 degrees Celsius. The maker would have placed the dried clay figure into the heart of the embers, allowing the heat to surround it evenly. The resulting hardness of the Nampa figurine tells us this process was successful. The creator understood the transformative property of heat on clay, a fundamental discovery that separates simple mud shaping from true pyrotechnology. This knowledge is a landmark in human development, and its apparent presence in such a deep time context is staggering. When we piece together this manufacturing story, the hand-shaped form, the lack of sharp tools, the open pit firing method, we can begin to build a speculative profile of its creators. The level of craftsmanship, while skillful in its own right, does not point to a specialized artisan class. This was likely made by an individual within a small, mobile band of hunter-gatherers. The technology is consistent with what we might expect from a very early, pioneering human population, or perhaps even from a different species of hominid altogether, such as Homo erectus. We know that Homo erectus was using fire and creating simple stone tools across Africa and Asia by around 2 million years ago. The cognitive leap to shaping a symbolic object from clay is enormous, but not necessarily impossible. The figurine's existence suggests a culture capable of abstract thought, one that saw value in creating a representation of the human form. It hints at a society with rudimentary beliefs, storytelling, or a sense of identity, all captured in this tiny, fragile sculpture. The very act of creating it, of investing time and energy into an object with no immediate practical survival purpose, speaks volumes about the inner world of its makers. They were not just surviving, they were thinking, creating, and leaving a mark, however small, of their presence on a continent that was supposed to be empty of them for another 1.5 million years. This tradition of creating small, human-like figures is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a thread that runs through the tapestry of human history across the globe. When we look at other ancient cultures, we find a powerful and recurring impulse to shape the human form in clay, stone, and bone. Perhaps the most famous examples are the Venus figurines of Upper Paleolithic Europe, dating from around 30,000 years ago. These statuettes, like the celebrated Venus of Willendorf, are characterized by their exaggerated female forms, voluptuous breasts, ample hips, and prominent bellies. For decades, archaeologists have interpreted them as symbols of fertility and abundance, perhaps as mother goddess figures or talismans meant to ensure the survival and prosperity of a community in a harsh Ice Age world. They represent a deep, symbolic concern with the sources of life itself, a reverence for the feminine that was molded into a portable, powerful object. On the other side of the world, in ancient Japan, the Jomon people were creating their own distinctive ceramic figurines known as dogu. These date from a period spanning roughly 13,000 to 2,300 years ago, and they are often strikingly different from the European Venuses. Dogu figures can have heart-shaped or goggle-eyed faces, elaborate patterns incised into their bodies, and sometimes appear as if they are wearing some kind of suit or armor. Their purposes are still debated. They may have been used in shamanistic rituals, perhaps representing deities or ancestral spirits, or they may have been imbued with a healing function, with a belief that a disease or misfortune could be transferred into the clay figure, which was then ritually broken to destroy the ailment. This shows us that the human form in clay could be a vessel for many things, not just fertility, but also spiritual connection, healing, and protection from unseen forces. When we place the Nampa figurine alongside these widespread traditions, its stark simplicity becomes even more eloquent. It lacks the specific, exaggerated sexual characteristics of the Venus figurines, and it bears none of the intricate pattern designs of the Jomon dogu. It is the essence of a human form, stripped down to its most basic components: a head, a body, limbs. This very plainness might be its most telling feature. It could represent an early, foundational stage in the development of this artistic and spiritual impulse. Perhaps it was a personal totem, a representation of an ancestor meant to be carried on a journey. Maybe it was a child's toy, a simple doll crafted by a parent, which would speak to the universal human desire to nurture and care for the young. Or it could have served a function in a coming-of-age ritual or a storytelling ceremony, a physical anchor for a myth or a lesson passed down through generations. Its purpose is hidden from us, but its existence alone testifies to a mind capable of abstract representation. This global context forces us to confront a profound possibility. If the Nampa figurine is genuinely 2 million years old, then the impulse to create anthropomorphic art, an impulse we see blossoming in Europe 30,000 years ago and in Japan 13,000 years ago, is not something that emerged relatively recently in our evolutionary story. Instead, it may be a fundamental, deep-seated aspect of the human, or even hominid, psyche that manifested in the Americas at a staggeringly early date. The Nampa figurine would then be a lone, surviving whisper of a symbolic tradition that existed an entire epoch before any other known examples. It suggests that the capacity for symbolic thought, for creating art that represents ourselves and our place in the world, is not the sole province of Homo sapiens. It hints that an earlier, different kind of human, perhaps Homo erectus, possessed a cognitive richness we are only beginning to glimpse. The beliefs of its makers, then, remain a profound mystery, but the object itself is a monument to a mind that could look at a lump of clay and see not just material but meaning, a mind that could envision a human form and had the desire and skill to bring that vision into the world, leaving a legacy not in grand monuments, but in a tiny, hardened piece of earth that would defy time itself. Given the geological and material evidence we have just explored, it's natural to wonder why the Nampa figurine and similar artifacts haven't simply rewritten the history books. Why do these objects remain on the fringes of discussion, treated as curiosities rather than catalysts for a fundamental rethinking of our past? This leads us into one of the most contentious and fascinating aspects of the mystery, the idea that inconvenient evidence is not just questioned but actively ignored or suppressed. This isn't necessarily a matter of a shadowy conspiracy, but rather a function of how scientific paradigms operate, especially when they are deeply entrenched. A paradigm is more than just a theory. It's the entire framework of accepted ideas, methods, and standards that define a field at a given time. It's the lens through which scientists view their world, and it powerfully determines what they consider to be legitimate questions and valid evidence. When an artifact like the Nampa figurine appears, it doesn't just challenge a single fact, it threatens the entire lens itself. This dynamic was famously analyzed by the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, who described the process of scientific revolution. Kuhn observed that for long periods, what he called normal science operates comfortably within an established paradigm, solving puzzles that the paradigm itself defines. But as anomalies accumulate pieces of evidence that stubbornly refuse to fit, the paradigm enters a state of crisis. Eventually, the weight of these anomalies can force a paradigm shift, a revolutionary change where the old framework is overthrown and replaced with a new one. Seen through this lens, the Nampa figurine is a classic anomaly. The initial reaction from the scientific establishment wasn't to celebrate a groundbreaking discovery, but to find ways to explain it away, because accepting it would have meant discarding the Clovis First paradigm decades before it was even formally articulated. The instinct to protect a foundational model is a powerful force in any human institution, including science. It's not that individual scientists are deliberately dishonest. It's that their entire worldview, their careers' work, and the prestige of their field can be built upon the very model that the new evidence threatens to topple. This resistance to paradigm-shifting evidence has historical precedents that feel eerily similar. In the late 19th century, a former U.S. congressman named Ignatius Donnelly became a prominent voice for what was then considered radical alternative history. In his influential books such as Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, Donnelly championed the idea of a lost, advanced civilization and argued that many anomalous archaeological finds were evidence of this forgotten epoch. While Donnelly's own theories were often speculative and sprawling, his core argument, that mainstream science was dismissing compelling evidence because it contradicted established timelines, resonated with a public fascinated by the idea of a hidden past. Figures like Donnelly and later writers like Charles Fort, who dedicated his life to cataloging anomalous phenomena, argued that a kind of scientific priesthood had emerged, one that was more invested in defending its authority than in following the evidence wherever it led. For them, finds like the Nampa Figurine weren't mistakes. They were relics of a forbidden history, systematically excluded from the official narrative to preserve the status quo. The mechanisms of this exclusion can be subtle but effective. It rarely involves a dramatic act of suppression. More commonly, it works through the peer review process, where papers challenging core paradigms face disproportionately high scrutiny and are often rejected. It works through funding bodies, which are hesitant to allocate scarce resources to projects that challenge foundational principles deemed settled science. And it works through academic gatekeeping, where young researchers quickly learn that pursuing controversial topics like pre-Clovis artifacts can be a career ender. An artifact that doesn't fit the model is often labeled an outlier and filed away, its implications left unexplored. The result is a kind of consensus by inertia. The established timeline isn't defended because it's been proven beyond all doubt against every challenge, but because the challenges themselves are never fully integrated into the mainstream conversation. They remain in the footnotes, the subject of debates at the edges of the field, but they seldom break through to the core textbooks and museum exhibits that shape public understanding. Consider the personal toll this can take on researchers who dare to challenge the consensus. Imagine being a geologist in the 1890s like G. Frederick Wright, utterly convinced of the undisturbed nature of the Nampa site, only to have your professional judgment dismissed not on the basis of a superior geological argument, but because your colleagues found the conclusion too disturbing to accept. Your choice then becomes a difficult one: continue to champion a marginalized idea and risk your reputation, or quietly let it drop and return to safer, more acceptable research. Many chose the latter, and in doing so, the momentum for a potential paradigm shift was lost. The story of the Nampa Figurine, therefore, is not just a story about an object, but a story about people, about the courage to present uncomfortable evidence and the institutional pressures that can silence it. It raises a profound question about the nature of scientific progress. Is it always a steady, rational march toward truth? Or is it sometimes a messy, contentious battle between old ideas and new evidence, where the victor is not always determined by data alone, but by the collective will of the scientific community to see the world anew? This brings us to a critical crossroads in our investigation, a point where our old geological certainties meet the dazzling potential of modern science. We are left with a fundamental question that seems, on the surface, perfectly answerable with today's technology. Why not simply redate the Nampa Figurine? If the controversy has raged for over a century, why not apply the powerful tools of the 21st century to finally settle the debate? The answer to this question is, in itself, a story that reveals as much about the challenges of studying such a singular artifact as it does about the science itself. Today, we have at our disposal a suite of advanced dating techniques that were the stuff of science fiction back in 1889. Two methods in particular stand out as being almost tailor-made for an object like this: thermoluminescence dating and optically stimulated luminescence dating. These are not techniques that rely on indirect geological context. They speak directly to the history of the object and the soil that held it. Let's break down how these remarkable processes work, starting with thermoluminescence or TL dating. This method is specifically designed for ceramics and fired clay objects like the Nampa Figurine. The principle is both elegant and powerful. Natural minerals, particularly quartz and feldspar, are found in all clay. These minerals are constantly bombarded by low-level background radiation from the surrounding environment, radiation that comes from trace amounts of radioactive elements like uranium, thorium, and potassium in the soil itself. This radiation causes electrons within the crystal structures of the minerals to become trapped at higher energy levels. When that clay is then heated to a high temperature, such as in a firing pit, that heat acts like a reset button. It releases all of those trapped electrons, draining the energy storage completely and setting the clock to zero. From that moment forward, after the object has cooled and been buried, the background radiation begins bombarding the clay again, and the electrons slowly build up once more within their crystal traps. In a laboratory, scientists can carefully heat a tiny sample of the artifact and measure the faint glow of light, the thermoluminescence, that is emitted as these trapped electrons are released. The intensity of this light is directly proportional to the total radiation dose the object has absorbed since its last firing. By measuring the light and calculating the annual radiation dose from the specific burial environment, scientists can calculate a remarkably precise date for when that clay was last fired. For the Nampa figurine, a successful TL test could theoretically tell us beyond any geological interpretation the exact epoch when an ancient hand placed it into the fire. The second powerful technique is optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL dating. While TL dates the last heating event, OSL dates the last time a sediment was exposed to sunlight. This method would be ideally suited for dating the very clay nodule that encased the figurine. The science is similar. Buried quartz and feldspar grains in the soil also trap electrons from background radiation. But sunlight is the reset button for OSL. When a grain of sand or a particle of sediment is exposed to sunlight, the light bleaches away the trapped electrons, resetting the signal to zero. Once that sediment is buried, sealed away from the sun's rays, the electron population begins to build up again. In the lab, by exposing these sediment grains to a specific wavelength of light and measuring the resulting luminescence, scientists can determine how long it has been since those grains last saw daylight. If one could obtain a sample from the interior of that cemented clay nodule, an OSL date could confirm the last time that specific matrix was exposed to the surface environment before being sealed for good. A date of 2 million years from the encasing nodule would be a stunning, independent confirmation of the original geological assessment. So, with these incredible tools just a test tube away, what is the holdup? Why does the mystery persist? The reasons are a complex mixture of physics, preservation, and perhaps politics. The first and most significant hurdle is the destructive nature of these tests. Both thermoluminescence and optically stimulated luminescence dating require the physical removal of material from the artifact itself. For TL, a small core, typically weighing a few hundred milligrams, needs to be drilled from an unobtrusive area of the figurine. For OSL, a sample of the surrounding clay nodule must be carefully extracted under controlled darkroom conditions to prevent any modern light exposure from resetting the clock. The Nampa figurine is small, fragile, and unique. It is a one-of-a-kind object with no parallel in the archaeological record. The institutions that have held it over the decades, such as the Smithsonian Institution, face an enormous ethical dilemma. Is it justifiable to damage, even slightly, an irreplaceable artifact for a test that, given the extreme proposed age, might not even yield a reliable result? These dating methods have practical upper limits. While TL can sometimes reach back several 100,000 years, pushing it toward a theoretical 2 million year date stretches the technique to its absolute extreme. The signal may have saturated, meaning the electron traps have been filled to capacity for so long that no further buildup is occurring, making an exact date impossible. The risk of damage might be deemed too high for a result that could ultimately be inconclusive. This leads to the second major challenge: institutional reluctance. The Nampa figurine is what is known as a paradigm-challenging artifact. For a major museum or research institution, associating itself with testing such an object carries a professional risk. If the tests were to return a modern date, it would simply confirm the mainstream view and the story would end. but if the tests were to return an astonishingly ancient date, even one that is just a few 100,000 years old, it would trigger a scientific earthquake. The institution that validated that date would be at the center of a firestorm of controversy, its credibility attacked by defenders of the established human migration timeline. The path of least resistance, unfortunately, is often to let sleeping anomalies lie. The artifact can be safely catalogued as a curiosity or an unidentified historical object, its troubling questions politely shelved rather than confrontationally answered. This isn't necessarily an active conspiracy. It is more often a form of institutional inertia, a reluctance to invest precious resources and reputation into a high-risk, high-controversy endeavor with no guaranteed payoff. Imagine for a moment that such tests were approved and successfully conducted. The outcomes would be world-changing regardless of the result. A modern date would finally lay the mystery to rest, closing a fascinating but ultimately erroneous chapter in the history of American archaeology. An ancient date, even one significantly younger than 2 million years, say 100,000 years, would still be revolutionary. It would utterly destroy the Clovis First model and force a complete reassessment of every other marginal and disputed site across the continents. The very fact that such a simple test holds the power to trigger this kind of paradigm shift is what makes the decision to perform it so weighty and so fraught with hesitation. The Nampa Figurine, therefore, exists in a kind of scientific limbo, its truth suspended between the powerful claims of its discovery and the modern world's cautious and sometimes reluctant tools of verification. It is a ghost at the feast of human history, a silent question that we now have the means to answer, if only we can summon the courage to ask it in the right way. This single artifact, if its story is true, does not just add a new chapter to the story of human migration. It burns the entire existing book and demands we start over from scratch. For generations, the tale of how humans first came to the Americas has been dominated by a single, powerful narrative, the Bering Land Bridge theory. This concept is elegant in its simplicity. During the last ice age, so much of the world's water was locked up in colossal glaciers that global sea levels plummeted, exposing a vast land connection between Siberia and Alaska known as Beringia. The story goes that around 13 to 15,000 years ago, small bands of highly adaptable Homo sapiens, our own species, followed herds of mammoth and other game across this grassy plain. They were the Clovis people, and according to the long-held model, they were the first pioneers to set foot in a pristine, uninhabited continent. They then supposedly found an ice-free corridor between two massive ice sheets and poured southward, rapidly populating North and South America in a geological blink of an eye. This has been the foundational textbook narrative, the clean, logical origin story taught in schools for decades. The Nampa Figurine, emerging from a 2-million-year-old layer of Earth, doesn't just question this timeline, it detonates it. If humans or a human-like species were in Idaho 2 million years ago, then the entire Bering Land Bridge scenario as we know it becomes irrelevant. At that point in deep time, the geography of the world was dramatically different. The continents were closer to their modern positions, but the climatic and glacial cycles were in a completely different phase. A land bridge like Beringia may have existed at various points, but the idea that our own species, Homo sapiens, used it is impossible because our species would not evolve for another 1.8 million years. This forces us into a truly radical line of questioning. Who, then, could have made this figurine? The only hominid known to have been widespread across the Old World at that time was Homo erectus. We have fossil evidence of Homo erectus from Africa to Java, a species renowned for its wanderlust and adaptability, known for using simple stone tools and possibly controlling fire. The staggering implication is that Homo erectus, or another as yet unknown hominid, must have made a journey of almost unimaginable scale, not just to the far reaches of Asia, but all the way into the heart of the Americas. This single artifact suggests that the story of hominid dispersal across the globe is far more ancient, complex, and incredible than we ever dreamed. This realization immediately pushes us toward alternative migration, routes that mainstream science has only begun to seriously consider for much later time periods. If the ice-free corridor inland was not available or not the path taken, what other possibilities exist? One compelling alternative is the coastal migration hypothesis. Imagine these ancient seafarers not as conquerors marching across a land bridge, but as adept coastal explorers navigating the shorelines of the Pacific. They wouldn't have needed sophisticated deep ocean vessels. Simple rafts or dugout canoes hugging the coastline, moving from one resource-rich estuary to the next, could have allowed for a slow, steady expansion from Asia, down along the coastline of Beringia, and then south along the northwest coast of America. This kelp highway theory suggests that these rich marine environments provided a consistent food source and a relatively ice-free route, even during glacial maximums. For a species like Homo erectus, which we know reached islands in Southeast Asia like Flores, some degree of water-crossing ability is not out of the question. The Nampa figurine, found far inland, could be evidence of a group that eventually moved away from the coast, following rivers like the Columbia and the Snake deep into the continent's interior. But the coastal route, while revolutionary for pre-Clovis theories, still operates within a generally accepted framework of moving from the Old World to the New via the North Pacific. The Nampa figurines' proposed age forces us to contemplate possibilities that are truly paradigm-shattering. Could there have been transoceanic contacts far earlier than anyone thought possible? The idea of prehistoric crossings of the Atlantic or the Pacific is typically relegated to the realm of fringe speculation, but an artifact of this age demands that we at least ask the question. Could a group have been swept across the Pacific on natural rafts of vegetation, a rare but documented occurrence? Or does the figurine point to a completely different and lost origin story for humanity in the Americas, one that does not involve migration from Asia at all, but an independent and tragically extinct evolutionary lineage right here on this continent? While this is the most speculative of all possibilities, it highlights the sheer scale of the mystery. When the established model collapses, every door, no matter how seemingly improbable, must be peeked through. Ultimately, the deepest impact of the Nampa figurine is not just on our maps, but on our understanding of human or hominid potential. A 2-million-year-old presence in the Americas speaks to a level of adaptability, resilience, and exploratory drive that we simply do not attribute to any hominid of that era. It suggests that the urge to explore, to push beyond the known horizon, is not a unique trait of modern humans, but a deeply ancient one, woven into the very fabric of our evolutionary family. These purported first Americans would have encountered a world alien to us, a landscape dominated by monstrous megafauna like giant short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, and mastodons. Surviving and thriving in that environment, and having the cognitive capacity to create symbolic art while doing so, paints a picture of a resourceful and complex culture, even if its tools were simple. The Nampa figurine, therefore, is more than a relic. It is a testament to a forgotten epic, a saga of exploration that likely ended in extinction, leaving behind only the faintest of echoes, like this single, crudely shaped piece of clay waiting for us to finally hear its story. So if we accept the possibility that the Nampa figurine is genuine, we are immediately confronted with its most profound and unsettling question: who on earth could have made it? The sheer age of the artifact forces us to look far beyond the familiar cast of characters in the human story and venture into a much deeper, more shadowy past. The most immediate and logical candidate, based on our current understanding of human evolution, is Homo erectus, we have abundant fossil evidence that Homo erectus was a truly cosmopolitan species, spreading from Africa across Asia, reaching as far as Indonesia by around 1.8 million years ago. This hominid was a revolutionary figure. They were the first to have body proportions similar to our own, the first to consistently use sophisticated stone tools like hand axes, and there is compelling, though debated, evidence that they had mastered the use of fire. The idea that a population of these robust, intelligent, and incredibly adaptable early humans could have continued their eastward expansion, eventually crossing into the Americas, is not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. If they could navigate the diverse environments of Asia, why not the plains and mountains of a new continent? The creation of the figurine would then represent a cognitive leap we haven't previously credited to them, the capacity for symbolic art. While no similar figurines have been found in Homo erectus sites in the Old World, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Perhaps this artistic expression was a unique cultural development of an isolated American population, a spark of symbolic thought that flickered into existence and then vanished without a trace elsewhere. However, the Homo erectus theory, while logical, opens up a new set of monumental challenges, primarily concerning the journey itself. How would such a species have gotten to Idaho? The conventional Bering Land bridge route would have been available at various points during the Pleistocene's fluctuating sea levels, but traversing Beringia is one thing. Surviving and thriving in the completely novel ecosystems of the Americas for hundreds of thousands of years is another. This line of thinking leads us to a second, even more radical possibility, that the makers were not Homo erectus at all, but a different, entirely unknown hominid. The fossil record is notoriously incomplete, a collection of scattered fragments from which we try to assemble a complete story. It is entirely plausible that another branch of the human family tree evolved in isolation in the Americas, a lineage that has left no skeletal remains for us to find. The environment of the Pleistocene was harsh and preservation is rare. The fact that we haven't found their bones doesn't mean they weren't there. This lost American hominid might have developed its own unique technologies and cultural practices, including the creation of small clay figurines, entirely independent of the evolutionary dramas playing out in Africa and Eurasia. The Nampa figurine could be the sole surviving relic of this forgotten chapter of evolution, a ghost lineage whose existence we can only infer from a single, stubborn piece of evidence. This speculation inevitably brings us to the relationship between these hypothetical first Americans and the indigenous peoples of the continents today. It is crucial to approach this with both scientific rigor and deep cultural sensitivity. The prevailing scientific consensus, supported by overwhelming genetic and archaeological evidence, tells us that the ancestors of modern Native Americans migrated from Siberia much more recently, within the last 15 to 20,000 years. If the Nampa figurine represents an earlier, different population, it in no way displaces or diminishes the profound historical and cultural connection of native peoples to these lands. Instead, it suggests a far more complex and layered history. The Americas, rather than being a pristine wilderness awaiting the first human footsteps, may have been home to multiple waves of inhabitants over millions of years. The earlier populations, whether Homo erectus or another hominid, may have faced extinction due to climate change, competition, or other factors, leaving the continent empty once more before the arrival of the ancestors of contemporary indigenous groups. In this scenario, the later migrations were not the first, but they were the ones that endured, whose descendants formed the rich tapestry of cultures that have shaped the Americas for millennia. The story becomes one of succession, not replacement, adding a tragic, lost prologue to the epic of human life on these continents. Exploring these possibilities forces us to reconsider the very nature of human resilience and adaptability. Surviving in the Ice Age Americas required incredible ingenuity. The makers of the figurine, whoever they were, would have shared their world with a stunning array of megafauna creatures like the mammoth, the giant ground sloth, and the saber-toothed cat. Navigating this landscape of giants would have required a deep understanding of the environment, sophisticated social cooperation, and innovative hunting and gathering strategies. The very act of creating a figurine, an object with no immediate survival purpose, hints at a culture that had the security and cognitive space to engage in symbolic thought. It suggests storytelling, ritual, a sense of identity, and an inner world that was rich and complex. They weren't just surviving, they were creating meaning. The Nampa figurine, therefore, is more than a tool or a trinket. It is a window into the mind of its maker, a mind that, despite the vast gulf of time separating us, sought to capture the human form and, in doing so, left a permanent record of its own existence. Its crudeness is not a sign of primitiveness, but a testament to a beginning, the first faint whisper of an artistic and spiritual tradition that would, much later, flourish in countless forms across the hemisphere. And so we arrive at the present-day chapter of this saga, the question of where this enigmatic piece of evidence actually resides now. After its tumultuous journey from the depths of an Idaho well into the heart of a scientific firestorm, the Nampa figurine did not simply vanish. For many years, its most famous home was within the hallowed halls of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It was accessioned into their collections, a tangible piece of a puzzle they could not quite solve, catalogued and stored alongside countless other artifacts that fit more neatly into the established narratives of human history. Its presence there was both a testament to its significance and a reflection of its awkward status. It was important enough to be preserved by the world's premier museum and research complex, yet too controversial to be placed on prominent public display as a definitive example of anything. The very act of preserving such a small, fragile, and contentious object presents its own unique set of challenges. The figurine is, after all, a fired clay object barely larger than a thumbnail. It has survived 2 million years in the ground only to face the potential perils of the modern world: fluctuations in temperature and humidity, the risk of physical damage from handling, and the slow, insidious threat of chemical degradation. The primary goal of any museum conservator is to stabilize an artifact, to halt the passage of time and preserve it in its current state for future generations. For the Nampa figurine, this likely means residing in a custom-fitted storage container within a climate-controlled vault where light, heat, and moisture are meticulously regulated. It is kept safe, but this very act of preservation can also feel like a form of sequestration, a quiet exile from the spotlight of scientific inquiry. This leads us directly into the modern layer of mystery that now surrounds the artifact. In recent decades, the precise whereabouts of the Nampa figurine have become somewhat unclear, adding a final, frustrating twist to its long story. While it was definitively part of the Smithsonian's collections for a significant period, some researchers and independent investigators have reported difficulties in locating it for further study in more recent years. Inquiries to the institution have sometimes been met with responses that the object cannot be readily located or that its current status is uncertain. This has understandably fueled speculation. Has it been simply misplaced within the vast, labyrinthine storage facilities of the Smithsonian, which house millions of objects? In such an enormous collection, it is not unheard of for a single small item to be temporarily lost, miscatalogued, or stored in an unexpected location. Or, more ominously, has it been deliberately set aside, a controversial piece intentionally kept in a kind of academic purgatory because its implications remain too disruptive to confront? The truth is likely less dramatic but no less significant. The figurine may indeed be sitting in a storage drawer, its catalog number waiting to be cross-referenced by a diligent researcher. It exists in a state of limbo, caught between its undeniable physicality and the unresolved questions it embodies. It is an artifact in waiting, preserved not only against the decay of time, but also against the need for a scientific paradigm courageous enough to re-examine it thoroughly. Its current obscurity is a poignant reflection of its entire history. It is an object that challenges fundamental beliefs, and as such, the path of least resistance has often been to acknowledge its existence while stopping short of championing its cause. It awaits a future generation of scientists, perhaps armed with even more sophisticated non-destructive testing techniques, who may be willing to risk their reputations to finally ask it the right questions and listen without prejudice to the answers it has held for so long. So where does this leave us today, more than a century after the figurine's discovery? The official position held by mainstream archaeology is one of cautious and often firm skepticism. While the Nampa figurine is acknowledged as a compelling historical curiosity, it has not been embraced as a legitimate piece of evidence for rewriting human history. The central pillar of this skepticism rests not necessarily on disproving the figurine itself, but on the immense weight of the broader archaeological record. For an object to overturn a paradigm as deeply rooted as the timeline of human migration, it cannot stand alone. It requires a chorus of corroborating evidence. To date, no other artifacts of a similar nature, nor any human or hominid fossils, have been found in North American contexts that are definitively dated to even a fraction of the 2-million-year mark. The entire structure of early American archaeology is built upon a foundation of sites and artifacts that consistently point to a much more recent human presence. In the face of this vast, consistent dataset, a single, anomalous object, regardless of its intriguing backstory, is simply not enough to force a revolution. It is treated as an outlier, an unexplained puzzle, but not a paradigm-shifting key. This skepticism is further bolstered by alternative geological explanations that, while challenging to prove, offer a less disruptive interpretation of the facts. Modern geologists might suggest that our understanding of the specific depositional environment at the Nampa site could be incomplete. They might propose the existence of a root pipe or a narrow, sediment-filled fissure that, while not visible to the initial investigators, could have allowed the object to work its way down from a much more recent layer over thousands of years. The process of concretion, where minerals cement sediment around an object, can sometimes occur more rapidly than previously thought under the right chemical conditions, potentially creating the illusion of a sealed, ancient context. The mainstream stance essentially argues that while the exact mechanism of how the figurine ended up at that depth may be elusive, it is statistically and scientifically more probable that some unknown geological quirk is responsible, rather than the entire established narrative of human evolution and migration being fundamentally wrong. It becomes a classic application of Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. In this case, a complex, unseen geological event is considered a simpler explanation than the existence of a 2-million-year-old human culture in the Americas. This position is not born out of stubbornness or a closed-minded conspiracy, but from the rigorous, cumulative nature of the scientific method itself. Science builds knowledge brick by brick, relying on reproducibility and a preponderance of evidence. A single data point, no matter how startling, cannot dismantle an entire edifice that has been constructed from thousands of other, mutually reinforcing data points. For mainstream archaeology to accept the Nampa figurine's claimed age, it would need to see a pattern. It would need to find similar figurines in other deeply buried, dated contexts. It would need to uncover stone tools in unambiguous 2-million-year-old strata. It would need to discover fossilized hominid remains that tell a new story. Until that pattern emerges, the figurine remains in a category that scientists often call irreducible anomaly, a piece that doesn't fit, but for which there is no larger picture to place it into. It is filed away, not forgotten, but waiting for the rest of the puzzle to somehow materialize around it. This creates a fascinating intellectual standoff, a dialogue between two different ways of weighing evidence. On one side, you have the powerful, direct testimony of the discovery itself, the first-hand accounts of the geologists, the description of the sealed clay nodule, and the physical patina on the object. This is a narrative built on specific, empirical observation from a single location. On the other side, you have the immense collective weight of the global archaeological record, which presents a consistent and coherent story that shows no signs of such an extreme human antiquity in the Americas. This is a narrative built on statistical probability and consensus. The debate over the Nampa figurine, therefore, is not really a debate about the object alone. It is a debate about how we validate knowledge. Do we allow a singular, powerful anomaly to break a model, or do we demand that the model only be changed when a new, consistent pattern emerges to replace the old one? For now, mainstream archaeology has chosen the latter, more conservative path, leaving the Nampa figurine as a ghost in the machine of human history, a whisper of a possibility that has not yet found its voice in the official story. Yet while mainstream archaeology has often relegated the Nampa figurine to a footnote, the story of this enigmatic object has been kept vibrantly alive by a different group of investigators, the passionate community of amateur archaeologists, independent historians, and alternative researchers. These individuals, often operating outside the rigid confines of academic institutions, have served as the figurine's most dedicated champions and detectives. Unburdened by the pressure to conform to established paradigms, they have approached the mystery with a different kind of rigor, one driven by curiosity and a deep-seated belief that some truths lie hidden in plain sight, dismissed simply because they are inconvenient. Their work has been crucial in ensuring that the figurine is not forgotten, constantly pushing for its re-examination and arguing that its compelling backstory deserves more than a skeptical shrug. They are the keepers of the anomaly, the voices asking the uncomfortable questions that more conventional science sometimes prefers to leave unanswered. Take, for example, the meticulous work of researchers who have revisited the original 19th century reports with a fine-tooth comb. While mainstream summaries might briefly mention the find before moving on, these independent scholars have immersed themselves in the primary sources, the personal letters of geologist G. Frederick Wright, the first-hand accounts published in now obscure scientific journals of the era, and the local newspaper stories from Idaho in the 1880s. They point out nuances that are often glossed over in official dismissals, such as the specific and repeated emphasis on the cemented, homogeneous nature of the clay nodule. They highlight the professional standing of the initial investigators, arguing that these were not gullible rubes but respected field scientists whose on-site observations should carry significant weight. By digging deeply into the historical record, these amateurs have reconstructed the discovery with a granular level of detail, building a powerful circumstantial case that the original context was as secure as the geologists claimed. Their contribution isn't in producing new data, but in refusing to let the old data be misrepresented or forgotten, acting as historical guardians for a piece of evidence that challenges the official timeline. Beyond historical analysis, this community has also been instrumental in publicizing the Nampa figurine and other such anomalies to a wider public. At a time when academic journals were the sole domain of specialists, it was often the books, magazines, and now websites and video channels run by independent researchers that brought these stories to light. Thinkers and authors who explore alternative history have featured the figurine prominently in their works, presenting it not as a settled fact, but as a profound mystery that conventional science has failed to adequately explain. They frame it as a classic example of what happens when evidence conflicts with a dominant paradigm. It isn't necessarily disproven, but is often sidelined, ignored, or explained away with increasingly implausible counter-hypotheses. Through their efforts, the Nampa figurine has become a staple in discussions about forbidden archaeology, capturing the imagination of a global audience and creating a groundswell of public interest that continues to pressure institutions for transparency and further study. The driving force behind this community is often a fundamental philosophical stance about the nature of scientific inquiry itself. Many of these researchers argue that true science should be a process of following the evidence wherever it leads, without preconceived notions about what is possible. From their perspective, the automatic rejection of artifacts like the Nampa Figurine represents a form of dogma, not skepticism. They see a blind spot in conventional science, a kind of institutional myopia where anomalies that don't fit the accepted model are filtered out at the peer review level, never receiving the funding or serious attention required to properly investigate them. The figurine, for them, is a symbol of this systemic issue. It's not that they claim to have all the answers, but rather that they are demanding the questions be asked with an open mind. They advocate for a fresh, unbiased look, one that utilizes modern technology without the burden of having to defend a century-old consensus, allowing the artifact to be evaluated on its own extraordinary merits rather than its disruptive implications. This dynamic creates a fascinating and often tense dialogue between two different cultures of knowledge. On one side is the world of academic archaeology, with its rigorous peer review, institutional gatekeeping, and reliance on a cumulative body of evidence. On the other is the world of independent research, driven by passion, public engagement, and a willingness to entertain radical possibilities. While the former accuses the latter of a lack of rigor, the latter accuses the former of a lack of courage. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. The academic system provides essential checks and balances against sensationalism, but it can also be slow, conservative, and resistant to foundational change. The independent community provides the creative friction and public pressure that can sometimes force a second look at forgotten evidence. In the long story of the Nampa Figurine, both groups have played a role. The academics provided the initial, credible documentation and the geological context that makes the artifact so compelling. The independents have provided the persistent voice, the historical memory, and the public platform that have kept the mystery from fading into oblivion, ensuring that this tiny piece of clay continues to ask its giant, unsettling question. The controversy surrounding the Nampa Figurine is far more than a simple debate over a single artifact. It serves as a powerful case study in the very nature of scientific discovery. What we are witnessing is not an isolated incident, but a classic example of how scientific knowledge evolves, or more accurately, how it often resists evolution until the pressure of anomalous evidence becomes too great to ignore. The journey of an idea from heresy to accepted fact is rarely a smooth one. It is typically a turbulent process marked by fierce resistance, institutional inertia, and a fundamental human reluctance to abandon comfortable and long-held beliefs. The story of this small clay figure is a microcosm of this grand and often messy intellectual drama. To understand this dynamic, we can look to other monumental shifts in scientific understanding that were initially met with similar skepticism. Consider the theory of plate tectonics. For centuries, the idea that continents could move was dismissed as ludicrous. The map of the world seemed permanent and fixed. When Alfred Wegener first proposed his theory of continental drift in the early 20th century, he was widely ridiculed. The scientific establishment attacked his idea mercilessly, not because his evidence of fossil and geological matches across oceans was weak, but because he could not provide a convincing mechanism for how the continents actually moved. The continents, they argued, were simply too solid to plow through the even more solid oceanic crust. It wasn't until decades later, with the discovery of seafloor spreading and the understanding of mantle convection, that the missing mechanism was found. Only then did the once ridiculous idea of wandering continents become the foundational principle of modern geology. The initial rejection wasn't about a lack of evidence, it was about a lack of a framework to make that evidence make sense within the existing paradigm. The medical world offers an even starker example with the germ theory of disease. For most of human history, the prevailing belief was that illnesses were caused by bad air or miasmas. When physicians like Ignaz Semmelweis observed that simple hand-washing could drastically reduce fatal childbed fever in maternity wards, he was not celebrated. Instead, he was ostracized and driven from his profession. His colleagues were insulted by the implication that their own hands could be carriers of death, and they rejected his findings because they contradicted their fundamental understanding of how disease worked. It took the later, painstaking work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch to definitively prove the existence of germs and establish the germ theory. The scientific community had to undergo a profound conceptual revolution, abandoning the familiar miasma model for a frightening new world teeming with invisible, deadly organisms. In both these cases and in countless others, the problem was not simply stubbornness. It was a cognitive and institutional inability to process evidence that lay outside the accepted boundaries of what was considered scientifically possible. This resistance is a natural function of what philosopher Thomas Kuhn termed normal science. Scientists, like all of us, work within a paradigm, a set of accepted theories, standards, and methods that define their field. This paradigm is incredibly useful. It allows researchers to solve puzzles efficiently without constantly questioning every foundational principle. It provides a shared language and a clear direction for inquiry. However, this strength is also its greatest vulnerability. A paradigm acts as a filter, shaping what scientists observe and what they consider to be legitimate data. Anomalies, pieces of evidence that don't fit the model, are often not seen as challenges to the paradigm itself, but as problems to be solved within the paradigm. They are explained away as measurement errors, contamination, or hoaxes. The Nampa figurine was treated exactly this way. Faced with an object that should not exist, the default response was to search for a flaw in the observation, a hidden fissure, a misidentified layer, a clever forgery, rather than to entertain the possibility that the entire timeline of human migration was incorrect. This is why the process of scientific correction is so often reluctant and slow. A paradigm shift does not occur simply because one contradictory piece of evidence is presented. It happens when the accumulation of anomalies becomes so overwhelming that the old framework can no longer contain them, and a new, more comprehensive theory emerges that can explain both the old data and the new anomalies. For the Nampa figurine to force such a shift, it would need to be part of a pattern. It would require the discovery of other, similarly ancient artifacts or hominid fossils in secure geological context across the Americas. Without that chorus of corroborating evidence, it remains a soloist singing a song that the rest of the scientific orchestra is not yet ready to play. Its fate is to be an outlier, a persistent question mark that challenges the consensus from the margins. This process, while frustrating for proponents of alternative ideas, is also what gives established science its stability and reliability. It acts as a bulwark against every fleeting fancy and poorly supported claim, ensuring that only the most robust and repeatedly verified ideas become part of our core understanding of the world. Ultimately, the lesson of Nampa is a humbling one for both skeptics and believers. It reminds us that science is not a pure, infallible algorithm that grinds inexorably toward truth. It is a deeply human endeavor, subject to all the biases, passions, and institutional pressures that characterize any human activity. The great theories of our time were once considered outrageous speculations, and it is entirely possible that some of today's most ridiculed anomalies will form the bedrock of tomorrow's textbooks. The true spirit of science, therefore, lies not in dogmatic defense of the status quo, but in maintaining a delicate and difficult balance, a steadfast commitment to rigorous evidence and methodological skepticism, coupled with a genuine openness to the possibility that we might be wrong. The Nampa figurine, sitting in its quiet storage drawer, is a permanent invitation to cultivate that openness, to remember that the map of human knowledge is still being drawn, and that the most exciting discoveries often lie just beyond the edges of the world we think we know. This small clay figure from Idaho, when we follow its implications to their logical extreme, pulls us far beyond a simple debate over migration timelines and into one of the most captivating and controversial realms of human speculation, the possibility of lost civilizations and forgotten cycles of humanity. The established narrative of a linear progression from primitive hunter-gatherers to complex agricultural societies is a story we all know well. But what if that story is incomplete? What if it represents just the most recent chapter in a much longer, more turbulent saga of human rise and fall? The profound antiquity claimed for the Nampa Figurine forces us to at least entertain this breathtaking possibility. If humans or their intelligent predecessors were present in the Americas 2 million years ago, what might they have achieved over the hundreds of thousands of years that followed? The complete absence of any other evidence for such a culture could itself be seen as evidence not of its non-existence, but of its almost total erasure by the relentless grinding of geological time and catastrophic events. This line of thinking finds a powerful and popular voice in authors like Graham Hancock, who has spent decades arguing that mainstream archaeology is guarding a flawed timeline. Hancock's central thesis is that a highly advanced global civilization flourished during the last ice age, a sophisticated culture of seafarers and astronomers whose world was shattered by a cataclysmic event, most likely the rapid sea level rise at the end of the Pleistocene epoch around 12,000 years ago. The survivors of this catastrophe, he suggests, traveled the world, imparting their knowledge of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy to the scattered, surviving hunter-gatherer populations, who then built the foundations of what we now recognize as the earliest known civilizations like Sumer and ancient Egypt. In this grand alternative narrative, the Nampa Figurine could be seen not as an anomaly, but as a potential relic from a far earlier cycle, a surviving whisper from a world that existed not 12,000 but 2 million years ago. Its crude form wouldn't signify primitiveness, but perhaps a devolution, a product of a post-cataclysm culture struggling to hold onto a fading memory of a more advanced past, or a simple, durable artifact from a culture whose more sophisticated achievements were made of perishable materials that vanished without a trace. The concept of a great catastrophe is a recurring theme in both mythology and geology. Cultures across the globe, from the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to the flood myths of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, tell strikingly similar stories of a world-destroying deluge. Plato wrote of Atlantis, a powerful island nation that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. For a long time, these stories were dismissed as mere allegory. However, modern geology has confirmed that the end of the last ice age was a period of immense and rapid environmental upheaval. As the massive glaciers melted, sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet, swallowing millions of square miles of coastal land that would have been prime territory for early human settlement. The Younger Dryas period, a 1,000-year-long climatic reversal that began around 12,800 years ago, is now suspected by some scientists to have been triggered by a cosmic impact, an event that could have caused firestorms, mega-tsunamis, and a dramatic nuclear winter effect. Such an event would have been absolutely devastating to any developing civilization, potentially resetting the clock on human progress and scattering its survivors to the winds. If a catastrophe of this scale could wipe away nearly all evidence of a sophisticated culture from 12,000 years ago, imagine what 2 million years of tectonic shifts, multiple ice ages, and continuous erosion could do to the remains of a society from a far more distant epoch. The Nampa Figurine, sealed in its deep clay tomb, might have survived precisely because it was so simple and so deeply buried, while the grander structures of its creators turned to dust. This perspective radically reframes the entire mystery of the figurine. the question is no longer just who made this, but what happened to the world they lived in. Proponents of alternative history point to other enigmatic sites around the world that seem to defy conventional dating. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive complex of carved stone pillars arranged in circles, was buried intentionally around 10,000 years ago, 1,000 years before the development of agriculture and pottery in that region. Its existence suggests a level of social organization and symbolic thought that traditional models did not predict for that time period. Similarly, the mysterious megalithic site of Gunung Padang in Indonesia is claimed by some researchers to contain man-made structures buried deep within a hill, with preliminary dating suggesting astonishing antiquity, though these claims are hotly debated. While these sites are orders of magnitude younger than the proposed age of the Nampa figurine, they serve as examples of how the archaeological record can still spring profound surprises, revealing complexities that challenge a simple linear model of progress. If such sites can force us to rewrite the story of 10,000 years ago, is it so unimaginable that evidence from 2 million years ago could rewrite the entire human story, pointing to a lost prologue of epic proportions? Ultimately, connecting the Nampa figurine to these grander narratives does more than just fuel speculation. It highlights a fundamental philosophical divide in how we view our own past. The mainstream conservative view is one of caution, prioritizing the evidence we have in abundance over the tantalizing hints of what we might be missing. It is a methodical, brick-by-brick approach to building knowledge. The alternative view, championed by thinkers like Hancock, is more panoramic and intuitive. It looks at the gaps in the record, the global myths of catastrophe, and the handful of stubborn, out-of-place artifacts, and weaves them into a different tapestry, one of forgotten glory, ancient wisdom, and cyclical disaster. In this view, the Nampa figurine is not an isolated oddity. It is a single piece of driftwood washed up from a sunken continent of time, a tiny, tangible clue that the human journey on this planet is far older, far stranger, and far more tragic than we have ever been taught. It invites us to consider that our civilization may not be the first to ask questions about the stars, to shape the world around them, or to create art in their own image, but that we might simply be the latest to do so, building our cities on the forgotten ruins of worlds we can no longer even conceive. While the academic debate over the Nampa figurine has often been confined to scholarly journals and conference halls, its mystique has broken free, spilling out into the vast landscape of popular culture where it has taken on a life of its own. Long before the internet, the figurine found its way into paperback books dedicated to the world's unsolved mysteries, becoming a staple of the forbidden archaeology genre. Authors like Charles Fort, who dedicated his life to collecting reports of anomalous phenomena, saw in artifacts like the Nampa figurine a pattern of dismissal by mainstream science. In his seminal works such as The Book of the Damned, Fort didn't necessarily claim to know the truth behind these objects. Instead, he masterfully highlighted their existence as evidence of a damned stream of data, facts and findings that were conveniently ignored because they disrupted the accepted narrative. The Nampa figurine, for Fort and his intellectual descendants, was not just a relic. It was a weapon in a philosophical war against what they perceived as scientific dogmatism, a perfect emblem of a past that refuses to behave. This role as a symbol of mystery was supercharged with the arrival of television and later the digital age. The figurine became a frequent guest on history and mystery-themed documentary series where its story was repackaged for a mass audience. Its most prominent platform has undoubtedly been the long-running show Ancient Aliens. On this program, the figurine is often presented not merely as evidence of an unknown human culture, but as a potential clue to extraterrestrial visitation. The show's theorists pose a provocative question. If humans weren't in Idaho 2 million years ago, then who could have crafted this object? Their narrative suggests that such out-of-place artifacts could be the handiwork of ancient astronauts, left behind as they interacted with or experimented on early hominids. While this interpretation is dismissed by virtually all professional archaeologists, its power lies in its sheer audacity. It takes a geological fact, the deep, undisturbed stratum, and uses it to construct a breathtaking science fiction scenario. The Nampa figurine in this context is no longer a humble piece of clay. It is transformed into a possible artifact of interstellar contact, a tiny, sculpted message from the stars that we have yet to fully decipher. The allure of the figurine, however, extends far beyond prime-time television. It has found a thriving home in the sprawling, interconnected world of online forums, YouTube channels, and alternative history blogs. In these digital spaces, the artifact is not a closed case but an open case file. Enthusiasts and independent researchers dissect the original 19th century reports, share high-resolution images, and debate every facet of the discovery with a level of passion that often surpasses that found in academic circles. Platforms like Reddit have dedicated communities where users pore over the geological maps of the Glens Ferry Formation, trying to independently assess the claims of an undisturbed context. Amateur investigators connect the dots between the Nampa figurine and other global anomalies, building vast speculative timelines of human history that are radically different from the textbook version. In this ecosystem, the figurine is more than an object. It is a catalyst for community and a shared sense of intellectual adventure, a central piece in a user-generated puzzle that thousands are trying to solve together. What is it about this particular artifact that grants it such enduring power in the popular imagination, especially when compared to other disputed finds? The answer lies in a potent combination of simplicity and scale. A complex, high-tech artifact would feel alien and might be easier to dismiss as a hoax. But the Nampa figurine is profoundly simple. It looks like something a child could make. Its very ordinariness makes its proposed extraordinary age all the more mind-bending. It's a relatable object, a tiny human form, and this relatability creates a direct emotional bridge between us and the deep, mysterious past. We can look at it and think, I could have made that. And then we are forced to confront the staggering implication, but could I have made it 2 million years ago? This intimate connection, coupled with the colossal time frame, creates a cognitive dissonance that is both unsettling and irresistible. It taps into a fundamental human desire for mystery, the longing to believe that the world still holds profound secrets, that history is not a solved puzzle but a grand, unfinished story with shocking revelations still waiting to be uncovered. Ultimately, the journey of the Nampa figurine from an Idaho well shaft to the screens of millions demonstrates how a single physical object can become a powerful cultural symbol. It has transcended its origins as a piece of evidence in a scientific debate to become an icon for the idea of the forbidden past. For believers in alternative history, it is a tangible piece of proof that we are being lied to, or at the very least that the full story is not being told. For skeptics, it serves as a classic example of how a compelling story can overshadow a lack of corroborating evidence. And for the vast audience in between, it is simply a fascinating, what if, a gateway into contemplating the vast, uncharted territories of our own history. The figurine's true legacy, therefore, may not be in rewriting the archaeological record, but in its undeniable success in capturing the human imagination, reminding us that sometimes the smallest objects can ask the very biggest questions, questions that continue to echo through books, documentaries, and digital forums, challenging us to wonder what else might be buried, both in the ground and in the pages of our own forgotten story. Ultimately, the enduring secret of the Nampa figurine isn't just locked within its clay substance, but within the unresolved tensions of the investigation itself. The core mysteries remain stubbornly intact, a checklist of unanswered questions that continue to tantalize and frustrate in equal measure. The geological context, as reported, seems to present an airtight case for an impossible antiquity, yet no other artifacts or human remains have been found to corroborate such a timeline in the entire North American record. The object itself, with its deep-set manganese patina and crude hand-shaped form, screams of genuine age, yet its very existence contradicts the foundational narrative of human evolution and migration. Was it truly shaped by a being 2 million years ago, or is there some incredibly rare and complex geological process, one that perfectly mimics a sealed context that we have yet to fully understand? This central question remains a chasm with compelling evidence on both sides, and no definitive bridge has yet been built to cross it. This leads directly to the most perplexing question for modern audiences. Why, in an era of technological marvels, has there not been a definitive modern analysis? We possess the tools like thermoluminescence dating that could theoretically read the internal clock of the clay itself, providing a direct age for its last firing. The answer is a tangle of practical challenges and profound institutional caution. The tests required are inherently destructive, demanding the removal of a small but irreplaceable sample from a one-of-a-kind artifact. For a museum curator or researcher, the ethical dilemma is immense. Is it justifiable to damage this unique object for a test that, given the extreme proposed age, might push the dating technique beyond its reliable limits and return an inconclusive result? Furthermore, the figurine has become a paradigm-challenging object, and engaging with it on a serious scientific level carries professional risk. An institution that validates its antiquity would be thrust into a firestorm of controversy, forcing a painful and disruptive rewriting of human history that many are simply not prepared to entertain. The path of least resistance, therefore, is often one of quiet preservation rather than confrontational investigation, leaving the figurine in a state of suspended animation. For the scientific community to collectively accept the figurine's authenticity, the discovery would need to transcend its status as a lone anomaly. A single data point, no matter how startling, is almost never enough to dismantle an entire paradigm built upon thousands of mutually reinforcing finds. Acceptance would require a chorus of corroborating evidence, a pattern. It would demand the discovery of other, similarly ancient artifacts in equally secure context across the Americas. It would require the unearthing of hominid fossils from Pleistocene strata, providing the who to go with the what. The evidence would need to be so overwhelming and reproducible that the only logical conclusion would be to abandon the old model and construct a new, more comprehensive one that can explain both the established record and these radical new discoveries. Until that pattern emerges, the figurine will likely remain in the category of an irreducible anomaly, a piece that doesn't fit the puzzle, but for which there is no larger picture to place it into. And so, the secret endures precisely because the evidence is tantalizingly strong yet frustratingly inconclusive. It is strong enough to prevent dismissal as a simple hoax, anchored by credible 19th century geological observations and the physical patina on the object itself. Yet, it is inconclusive in the face of the immense collective weight of the global archaeological record that shows no other signs of such an extreme human presence. This perfect tension is what grants the Nampa figurine its enduring power. It is a ghost in the machine of history, a whisper from the deep past that is just loud enough to make us question everything we think we know, but just quiet enough to be explained away by those who are not yet ready to listen. It persists as an open invitation, a challenge to both our scientific methods and our intellectual courage, waiting for the day when we are finally prepared to answer its call with the open-minded rigor it has deserved for over a century. So here we are, standing at the edge of a profound and unresolved mystery. We began with a simple question drawn from a single, astonishing discovery, a small, hand-molded clay figure pulled from a deep, sealed layer of Idaho earth that dates back 2 million years. We've walked through the meticulous geological reports that insist the stratum was undisturbed, The compelling evidence of the manganese patina clinging to its surface, and the fierce, century-long debates that have pitted raw field observation against the formidable walls of scientific consensus. We've seen how this one artifact doesn't just challenge a date on a timeline. It threatens to unseat the entire story of the peopling of the Americas, suggesting a human or hominid presence so ancient it predates our own species and hints at cognitive abilities we never imagined for that deep past. The evidence for its authenticity is stubbornly compelling, yet the lack of corroborating finds leaves it isolated, a solitary sentinel from a time we cannot yet fully envision. This journey reveals something far greater than a debate over a single artifact. It exposes the very nature of how we uncover our past. History is not a clean, finished book waiting to be read. It is a fragmented, incomplete puzzle with most of the pieces forever lost to time. What remains is a collection of clues, and sometimes those clues contradict the story we have so carefully written for ourselves. The Nampa figurine is one of those disruptive clues. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our understanding is provisional, that the maps of human history are still being drawn, and that the most exciting discoveries are often the ones that don't fit. It's a testament to the fact that the ground beneath our feet holds secrets that can, in an instant, render our most cherished narratives obsolete. As we reflect on this tiny, enigmatic figure, its ultimate power may not lie in providing a definitive answer, but in the profound questions it continues to ask. It is a relic of a world forgotten not just by us, but by time itself. It represents the possibility of lost journeys, extinct cultures, and cycles of human experience that have left no other trace. It is a whisper from the darkness, reminding us that arrogance has no place in the study of the past, and that humility, the willingness to admit how much we do not know, is the true hallmark of a curious and open mind. The greatest historical mysteries are not those we solve, but those that compel us to keep looking, to keep questioning, and to remain awestruck by the vast, uncharted territories of our own story. So we leave you with this final thought and a question to ponder. The evidence sits before us, fraught with contradiction and brimming with implication. After considering everything, the depth of its discovery, the passion of its defenders, and the skepticism of its critics, where do you stand? Do you believe the Nampa figurine is a genuine artifact, a solitary piece of proof from a forgotten chapter in the human saga? Or do you see it as a geological fluke, an object that found its way into an impossible context through some rare and unseen natural process? The conversation doesn't end here. This is where yours begins. We want to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts, your theories, and your own conclusions in the comments below. The search for truth is a collective endeavor, and every voice adds another piece to